Muy bienvenidos una vez más al canal de YouTube del Instituto Cervantes de Manchester y de Leeds. Mi nombre es Pedro Eusebio y soy el director. Welcome once again to the YouTube channel of Instituto Cervantes in Manchester and Leeds. And as usual, first of all, I would like to extend a warm welcome to our guest, Dr. Cecilia Enjuto-Rangel, Dr. Sebastian Faber, Dr. Pedro García-Caro, Dr. Robert Newcomb, and Dr. Rosi. Thank you for joining us on this second event of 2023 of our series Ex Libris Publications in Hispanic Studies, which started now. We are in the second year and has been organized with the cooperation and the essential support of Professor Rosi, who is the deputy head of the School of Modern Languages and Culture of the Durham University in England. In this series, as you might know, some of our audience are following this series, if not from the very beginning, but we have quite a few of you who already know the series and have been participating. We try to share the research and to discuss the recent works on the topic of contemporary Hispanic culture in the British and also in the American academia. I would like now to introduce our host guest is Professor Rosi, who has published many works in contemporary Spanish culture, film, and literature. And some of her publications, just to know a few, is Lost in Transition, Constructing Memory in Contemporary Spain, A Taste of Barcelona, The History of Catalan Cooking and Eating as co-author, and the book, which was also presented, not in the series of the Libris, but when this was published, it was presented in Cervantes, Manchester and Leeds as well. Also, Traces of Contamination, Unearthing the Francoist Legacy in Contemporary Spanish Discourse, and Towards a Cultural Archive of La Movida as co-editor. The articles of Professor Rosi have appeared in the Journal of Spanish Cultural Studies, MLN, Revista de Estudios Hispánicos, Romance Notes, Hispamérica, Revista Iberoamericana, and Hispania, among others. Our special guests tonight, Cecilia Enjuto-Rangel, Sebastian Faber, Pedro García-Caro, and Robert Newcomb, are the editors of this excellent book, Transatlantic Studies, Latin America, Iberia, and Africa. It has been published by Liverpool University Press, and is a book on which it performs an ongoing debate about the transatlantic approaches in the fields of Iberian, Latin American, African, and Luso-Brazilian studies. In the 35 essays, leading scholars have been analyzing and discussing about the connecting the spaces and the relations between the former Spanish and Portuguese empires. As the object of the study of this book, Transatlantic Studies just guesses what could be considered the traditional approach on national state as the entity to analyze the not only history but the many cultural relations, and with a different approach, more enriching. One of the results is this excellent book. Before I give the word to Rosi, I would like to remind you that in this series we intend to establish a dialogue not only with the authors, but also the audience. And in that sense, you are all of you very welcome, and invite you to participate, put in the questions in our chat, and then Professor Rosi will ask our guest. So without further ado, sin nada más que añadir, Rosi, tienes la palabra. Muchas gracias.
Muchísimas gracias. Thank you so much for that kind introduction that some of you that are assisting, following us, Ex Libris must be a little bit tired of. But anyway, thank you so much again for that introduction. And let me quickly introduce our participants this afternoon. as I am introducing them, Carlos, our the support from Instituto Cervantes, will put their affiliations and their bios on the chat in the chat box. So I'm joined today by the editors of the volume that already Pedro Sevilla has mentioned, Transatlantic Studies, Latin America, Iberia, and Africa, which was published in 2019 by Liverpool University Press. It has been a few years, but it's such a rich contribution to the field that we thought you'd be very timely still to continue this conversation. So I'm very pleased to be joined by Professor Sebastian Faber, who teaches Spanish at Oberlin College in Ohio, the United States, by Dr. Cecilia Enjuto-Rangel, who is Associate Professor of Spanish at the University of Oregon in Eugene, by Dr. Pedro García-Caro, who's Associate Professor of Spanish also at the University of Oregon, and Professor Robert Patrick Newcomb, who teaches Luso-Brazilian and Hispanic Latin American literature at the University of California, Davis. Welcome, and thank you for joining us this afternoon. So one of the conversations that we had about your incredibly rich volume that actually contains 35 contributions plus introduction and the conclusion is we can't really do justice to each contribution and each author. So we should take a different approach to how we talk about this volume. I think that your project deserves some good meta discussion because it's really a reflection of the field of Iberian studies or perhaps Latin American studies or peninsular studies, areas of studies that have been more traditionally aligned and described over the decades, but also in the sense of institutional organization. And I thought that you'd be really interesting to have this conversation removed from the American academia, from where we are, at least based here from the UK, and perhaps the distance occupying sort of that space of the transatlantic or the Atlantic could give us some space for this discussion. So I'd like to start with this sort of general question to you. And I think that as you see the question, one of you could start answering and involve the others, or actually highlight some of your the work that your contributors have done for this volume. So having read these essays, I think that your volume sits on two different axes of history, space, and time, right? One that relates to the term transatlantic, and the other one that relates to the term studies. And I think that this vision already has been pointed out by some of your contributors in the volume. And these two terms are connected to in a way to sort of institutional organization and the way discipline boundaries have been formed throughout throughout time, right? So could you start by explaining this two-side perspective present in your project?
Well, on behalf of the editors, I'd like to thank you, Rosi, and the Instituto Cervantes in Manchester, and of course, all of the public attending today, including some of our contributors, Benita, Francisco, I can see on the list, and also even some of our graduate students in our robust program of graduate studies here at the University of Oregon, which is also transatlantically oriented. It's a key question that you are asking, and it's, I think, multifaceted. First, you're partly asking how can we disengage ourselves from the medium in which the project was conceived, which is, of course, part of its kind of epistemic conditioning. It's the framework within which we think. The field is, of course, derived from the fact that we are not in a place necessarily of analysis, much like Spain or Mexico or Morocco. And we are really thinking, therefore, the field from that sort of vantage viewpoint of the non-national boundaries of the American Academy. I think it really, the relationship of transatlantic studies with the rebuttal of the nationalist narratives within the field of literary studies, with which they were born in the 19th century in particular, is one of the tensions that we really wanted to highlight throughout the volume, both in the introduction, but certainly in the arrangement. I realized there were, of course, within the Instituto Cervantes itself, an institution that derives from the Instituto de la Hispanidad, born out of the Spanish Civil War, and which itself is sort of embedded with these narratives of ownership and Eurocentrism. And it's, in my knowledge over the years of the Instituto Cervantes, it would be an object of the study of Transatlantic studies. You know, how do states, how do Spanish-speaking, Portuguese-speaking states deal with the legacies of empire, the legacies of culture, as this culture is no longer owned by the former metropolis, but by a variety of cultural agents and a variety of nation states. So that would be, I think, a first sort of polemical response within which we think the field is really a very robust space for critical rethinking of institutional formations, archival formations associated with those institutional spaces, and also provokes more questions perhaps than well-defined sort of epic narratives of the community, and shows very often that the emperor is naked. But I'll pass on the microphone to my colleagues, my co-editors here.
I think that your quick review actually does speak about opening some of the structures from which we have began or we were formed in our disciplines. And perhaps that question then is again, how is that still reflected within the structure, the institutional structures that we are working from? And how does this kind of work open or bring change to those structures? Or can they?
I think that one of our premises, we start out from institutional awareness, right? So we don't try to pretend our material existence is not there in institutions, private or public, located in national spaces and largely shaped by, for example, educational policies in those national spaces or federalized spaces, as in the case of the US, right? So I think our first principle is it was to not ignore those institutions. And the second one is then, therefore, the acknowledgement that if we want to change the way we do things, we have to start changing those things institutionally. It's not enough to engage in grand rhetorical gestures or to call for change. It's a matter of like committee work and writing memos and making change. And starting with the very basic, which is the syllabus of a course, right? The reading list and those kind of, or language requirements. So we try to play both. We try to both work at a very high kind of the meta level in institutional history, but at the same time be really aware of that. Which is why in our epilogue we call attention to the crisis in which we all are, institutionally speaking, right? We have fewer and fewer departments and less funding, and more precarious colleagues. So that's a reality that we have to take into account if we want any of what we say to really carry any weight. So that's kind of the institutional awareness from which we try to speak, and hence also our emphasis throughout on pedagogy, right? And the idea like the value of the field is demonstrated by the work done in it, right? That's the other basic principle of this volume. And I think that all 35 contributions mean to show what is possible within the field, including a critical view of the field itself, right? That's, I think, what Pedro is getting at, that this, we try to sort of, in a way, co-opt our critics or make room for our critics within the field, because that's institutional critique is to us is one of the main ingredients of the whole field to begin with, and one that we think was too weak in a sense in Hispanism, for example, traditionally speaking.
Thank you, Sebastian. And I think that going to that comment about how do you co-opt or make, fit within your project the existing views about transatlantic studies. You mentioned actually in your introduction, or you highlight 3 of them. So perhaps as a way of introducing this sort of topic of transatlantic studies or its boundaries or its aims, can we quickly review what were those views? I mean, what are some of the works previously done on transatlantic studies or the views around it that you're engaging with, that you're putting in conversation, and you're putting in context as well?
Yeah, I can do that also super quickly. I mean, it's good always to sort of relativize how new all this is, right? So anybody who works on the Spanish Empire has always worked transatlantically necessarily, right? So one of the things we point out in the introduction is that really transatlantic studies is new to the extent that it tries to look with a different lens at the relationships, the transatlantic relationships between different cultures and countries post-independence, for example, right? But the 3 views that you refer to are really, one is kind of a celebratory view of transatlantic studies that really started coming up in the late 80s and early 90s, closely tied to the 1992 as the 5th centenary of the Encuentro or Descubrimiento, or however you want to call it, and sort of tied in with the Instituto Cervantes, which was founded around that time. And this notion is like, how great is it that so many people in the world speak Spanish, and can't we just all get along? It's a little bit a caricature, but it is kind of the spirit of the field. And Julio Ortega is really the driver of that from Brown University, with these massive, important conferences in which figures like Carlos Fuentes, Mexican author with strong Hispanophile feelings, pro-Spain feelings, sort of were a leading voice. At the opposite end is a second view that basically says transatlantic studies, as it's emerged, especially in the U.S. Academy since the mid-90s, is really a Trojan horse for Hispanism to reestablish its hegemony it lost in the 60s and 70s to Latin American studies. And 2 of the critics, 2 of the people we have voicing that very critical view in the volume are Abril Trigo at Ohio State, who as a Latin Americanist says, look, these peninsularists are unhappy with their marginal position, and they're trying to reclaim territory in all these departments that we have, and we won't go for that. It's a ploy, right? So he's very critical of that. And then from the other end, Joan Ramon Resina, from comparative literature and Catalan studies or Iberian study view, says, look, transatlantic studies is so suffused with the Spanish language that it tries to reestablish the hegemony of Spanish over other languages that led to cultural expression in this large transatlantic space. So we have incorporated both of these views in the book. Most other contributions represent really a third view, which is one that acknowledges the validity of those critiques, and yet says, but there's very important things that we can do, right? So if we work from an institutionally critical perspective with an awareness of our history, with an authentic will to inclusivity when it comes to cultures, languages, types of objects of study, then there's a lot that we can do. So the third view, which starts out really with the work done by Joseba Gabilondo, for example, in the mid-90s, thinks of Iberian or transatlantic studies as an African, as a kind of a critical space from where all the other surrounding fields can be redefined, including, for that matter, Anglophone transatlantic studies, right, which came with Paul Gilroy's work, right, very important, but which kind of pretended that the southern transatlantic didn't exist, really. There was never room in that framework for that. So this is we're staking out the field, right, in a way, and we're doing that in relation to the Anglophone as well.
Yes, and in fact, you do mention the certain perspective from the transatlantic studies. So having discovered sort of this 3 view that look at the things that we can do, do you want to highlight some of the work that can be done from the transatlantic studies perspective. Perhaps Robert or Cecilia can highlight some of that work or something that you yourselves actually learned through the process of curating this volume.
Well, I'm happy to talk a little bit more about and continue the conversation. Thank you again. It's wonderful to be able to go back to this book that was published just before the pandemic. And we had so many opportunities that were planned just when the pandemic happened. And so I think that it's great that we can still be able to discuss it and hopefully incorporate it more and more into our own classes and into our own works. So having said that, I in many ways agree with Pedro and Sebastian, I'm sure with Robert, in that the three, there are different ways of approaching the field that we tackle in the introduction and throughout the book, the pedagogical and the methodology, and then the theoretical. I think that the three of them in many ways speak to each other and merge and nurture each other. So, and this speaks to also the first question, or one of the first questions that was raised on how do we institutionally change things, or at least move them forward, or at least rethink within the limits of our respective institutions, how to stake out the field in that sense, rethink the field. And I think that, for example, we at the University of Oregon have been doing, some colleagues more than others, but I've been working in my classes through a transatlantic perspective from the very beginning. So for the last 17 years, I don't think I've ever taught a course that's only on Latin America or only on Spain. Mainly it's because it's my viewpoint. Mainly it's because also I've had that liberty and that freedom to construct my own courses. And also because from the very beginning, we decided to change introductory courses. So we decided when I first got to the University of Oregon that we're changing our surveys, and we're not following the idea of only Spanish or peninsular literature and only Latin America, that we were putting them in contact, because we thought that students as well would get a stronger historical perspective and background if they saw the dialogue, the debates, the challenges that arise from seeing the historical and literary connections between what can be considered two different fields that through transatlantic studies are merged. And so I think that's going back to, again, also a question that was raised, or the idea of thinking why staking out the field is interesting as well. Thinking of the term stake, I was going back to it. I'm like, wow, why did we use the term stake? It's kind of like there's so many different definitions to it that are problematic in itself, because it is, we don't want to put the field in the stake in a way, but thinking about how we can conceptualize different limits and different, at the same time, its boundaries and challenge them. And I think that's what Sebas was speaking about, how we in our book give voice to Resina and to Abril Trigo and consider them fundamental interlocutors, actually. And at the same time, for example, have colleagues that are working on Catalan literature in Mexico, and so and in our classes we can teach. I taught a course on contemporary poetry where I incorporated poetry in Mapuche, in Catalan, in Euskera, in Castellano, in Portuguese, and so in Nahua, and so I think that it ends up being through translation, and so usually into Spanish or English, depending of if I had the translation into English, it would be into English, otherwise into Spanish. But I think that actually proves that there are many ways, creative ways of tackling those, challenges or debates.
Thank you. So in the process of curating, so in the process of putting this volume, and I think that your examples in the classroom, Cecilia, are really great. How do you expose your students to this rich variety of materials that perhaps actually focusing on the work rather than the structures by nation or by field, you are also opening sort of the students to a different experience. You can provide different access to the material that they're studying. But in that process of opening that field from that perspective, what are some of the other lessons that you have learned in terms of organizing what they're learning? Do you still deal with a time frame? Do you allow them, a certain organization, to understand the material that they're learning? And I think that my question also has to do because with the own researchers, right? So when you have a volume that is so diverse, there's so many archives, so many possibilities, but it also is a bit dizzying, to find a word, because there is so much. So how do you bring, perhaps if not focus, what is sort of the principle that guides perhaps this kind of intellectual work? And also not so much about the word staking out, which I do agree. It caught my attention because I thought it was a very forceful a word, especially in light of some of the arguments brought, for example, by Resina or Trigo. But yeah, so I'd like to hear a little bit more about your own reflections.
I can jump in if that's okay.
Yes.
I mean, for me at least, I think that one of the only sort of commonalities between some of these very diverse contributions, aside from the fact that all of these contributions exist within one form or another of transatlantic studies as a field, is the notion of comparatism. They're all comparative in one way or another. And for me, I think that is one of the guiding principles. And we discussed this in the introduction to the volume. And one of the real benefits of engaging with transatlantic studies as a concept and as a field, comparativism helps open up new terrain. It also prevents us, I think, in a sense, from becoming overly inward looking and maybe reifying certain ideas that are historically inherited in terms of the tradition of academic Hispanism. By taking a non-hierarchical and comparative approach to the materials, we're able to put these notions, we're able to question some of these notions, for example, and I think that's always helpful. So that would be my succinct answer. Another thing that I would mention, and this is more in response to some of the previous comments about the value of a project like this, is that I think that this volume and similar contributions within transatlantic studies, Iberian studies, and sort of associated critical interventions that are generally comparatively oriented or that push back against sort of the established forms of Hispanist scholarship, is that these volumes provide a kind of intellectual ballast that in a classroom setting we can use to normalize the idea for our students that these sorts of transatlantic, comparative, non-hierarchical, perhaps still in a sense non-traditional approaches have value. It's important to do the work if we want to change the way that this field is taught, and to both produce scholarship that allows our students to find kind of, this sounds pretentious, but a sort of intellectual authority that allows them to design projects that move away from the way things have been done in the past, And it's complementary work to what Sebastian mentioned about work being done in committees, writing course proposals, producing syllabi, that as Cecilia mentioned. That it's vitally important to design our syllabi multilingually, comparatively, and in doing so to question some of the ways in which our disciplines still reinforce national boundaries, even in terms of disciplinary organization. In my department, for example, our courses are listed as either peninsular or Latin American courses, regardless of the fact that most of us by now don't really teach within one of those two sort of rigidly defined geographic areas, and we cross over it, but still our students get the impression, because of the way our courses are listed, that they're going to take a Latin American studies course or a peninsular studies course, which completely erases even the presence of Portuguese, which is my field of specialization. So we're still, that work of changing the way, even things like departmental nomenclature, course headings, work that can take years in bureaucratic environments is vitally important. But it's complementary to the kind of intellectual work that this volume and similar volumes, many of which we cite in our own, do at the level of scholarship.
Thank you so much for that, Robert. And I think I really appreciate sort of that focus that you bring to the notion or the work of, or the way we think about researching and studying in terms of the comparison or comparativism as you have it there. I also think that a lot of what your works demonstrate is also points of contact, right? And how actually you're opening up sort of understanding that contact happens in very different ways as well, right? So it's not only sort of through an official discourse, it's not solely, sort of official archives. There are different ways of understanding sort of that experiencing each other. I was thinking in that sense, and going back to that institutional organization, some of the tension that you've highlighted there, for example, from Peninsular to Latin American, and especially I think that thinking a little bit from that institutional organization in US academia, how would you incorporate, or how do you open up that conversation with the field of Latin American studies, right? As some of these conversations or some of the criticisms perhaps towards transatlantic studies from our colleagues from Latin American studies have sort of expressed, I think that you do include a lot of Latin Americanists and especially early modernists actually in that conversation. And it seems that perhaps the colonialists have a better sort of approach to this sort of comparison, right? Rather than some of the more contemporary fields of study. So how do you navigate that tension?
If I may, I think it's a crucial issue, and it's one that can only be thought of in terms of the notion of triangulation, in that Latin American studies as currently conceived in the US is clearly a kind of imperial domination epistemic machine by the Cold War US Department of State, and so it really was conceived as this kind of geopolitical epistemic notion of the Penn Literary Club and all of these outlets to sort of seduce and control this informal empire that the US developed in the hemisphere, much like the UK had also done in different ways with the emergence of individual break-apart republics throughout the 19th century in Latin America. So I think, if anything, the sort of questioning that transatlantic studies may bring to the fore of Latin American studies is, again, pointing to the roots of the configuration of the field itself as bound to the geopolitical structures of knowledge power that emerged in a very dated time frame. That disallow us from seeing that the entire period of modernism was about a debate about the where the center of culture in Spanish-speaking publishing circles really was cited, or the literary boom, which, even though it's called in English, really took place in places as diverse as Santiago de Chile, Havana, and certainly Barcelona, was crucial for the emergence of the literary boom, but also its translations into French and English. So again, as my colleagues have been saying, comparativism and decentering of institutional frameworks, of traditional frameworks of knowledge creation, are really the kind of enriching and really fun activity that we engaged in with this volume, trying to poke holes into the very sort of well-established meta-narratives of the fields and of the institutional configurations of fields as still practiced forcibly sometimes. In the case of, say, just right before we started the conversation, publicly we were talking about how in Holland, innovation can only happen within a certain paradigm dictated by centralized sort of Ministry of Education. Similarly, in Spain, the space for Latin America is fairly limited within líneas de investigación, which really are dictated from above and not sort of from below. And of course, this allows us to see that what we're trying to do really in the text might actually not fit very well within many of these sort of centrally defined lines that also happen in individual departments across the world, even in places that are more autonomous. But try to really drive the conversation towards this sort of metacritical debate that is so necessary for understanding marginalized voices and marginalized angles that otherwise would not be considered.
Right. And I think that part of the conversation also has to be about visualizing sort of who the players are. I mean, even in the context of Latin American studies, we are lumping a lot of countries in one label, right? Without paying attention to regional distribution, languages, people, and so on. So even to fight diversity within Latin American studies, I think it is a task to be accomplished, actually. It's sort of in the process of understanding that diversity. I mean, I want really to open the conversation to our listeners, because I'm sure there are a lot of interesting questions out there. But before I do that, I wanted to see if you have a better sense, perhaps, having done this work and having sort of thought about this almost a three-prong approach, right? You have the pedagogical question, you have a question of methodology, and you have a question of the theory that underpins this project. Having done all that and having sort of weighed these 35 contributions plus your introduction and your conclusion, what do you think sort of the timing of it? Like, what do you think should, I mean, obviously they all have to happen somehow at the same time, but I don't want you to rank these items, but perhaps can you find sort of lines of connection that could be thought out in order to make this work perhaps more efficient and productive towards actually changing our landscape of our institution, but also of our field?
I have a kind of a brief comment about that, if that's all right. I'm a big proponent of an incremental approach to changing the way that sort of teaching occurs within a field that in the case of my department is referred to as Spanish and Portuguese. I think that sometimes what happens within somewhat insurgent or metacritical projects within these fields is that the proponents end up engaging in heated and sometimes less than productive debates about theory and method prior to actually doing the work of putting together scholarship or proposing courses of curricular reform in these fields. So for me, I think there needs to be a constant sort of mutually reinforcing dialogue between the production of scholarship and some of the on-the-ground efforts that Sebastian highlighted in his answer to a previous question. I think that at least reflecting on the sort of institutional conditions in my university, and I imagine that this extends to many other institutional contexts, it's a mistake to sort of think about implementing transatlantic studies or any other sort of complementary metacritical approach, Iberian studies being another example. It would be a mistake to try to implement these sort of all at once. It just would not work politically. And so I think thinking in terms of incremental steps, some of which Cecilia highlighted, changing one syllabi, constantly reflecting on what these sort of the unspoken exclusions are within our syllabi. That's something that makes sense. And I think that over time, this approach, being attentive both to scholarship and to these changes in our own teaching practices, lobbying for curricular changes in our respective departments, that's the way that, for me at least, we change the conversation over the long term. I've been a part of debates within transatlantic studies or Iberian studies that ultimately end up going nowhere because there's such attention to trying to find a grand unified theory of this field, which, within the context of animated scholarly discussions between multiple participants who have strong opinions is not going to happen. So that would be my answer. I'm not sure if my co-editors agree, but that's sort of my approach to these questions.
Great. So before Cecilia jumps in, I'm going to invite our audience members to start typing your questions or be ready with your question once we finish this part of the discussion. Yes, Cecilia, please go ahead.
I was just very briefly going to agree with Robert. I think that the productive thing of transatlantic studies as a field is that there is no grand theoretical question or viewpoint that unites everyone, but the contrary. It's just constantly re-challenging itself as a field and thinking of what we're doing and why we're doing it is productive in itself. And I do think that only engaging into the theoretical perspective without integrating it into our classroom and into the intellectual discussions that we do in our classroom would be also not productive. I think it makes sense. This makes sense if we bring it into the classroom and we discuss it with our students and we listen to their viewpoints as well. And we change our syllabi as well by discussing and integrating other people's and different perspectives into it. And so and at the same time, I understand that there's it depends a lot on what you're talking about and what you're discussing and the particular topics that you want to focus in each class. If you want to discuss the avant-garde, it's really easy and fruitful to discuss it from a comparativist and a transatlantic perspective. But even if you discuss something that could be considered a topic that could be considered a nationalist or a national topic, like the Spanish Civil War, you should discuss it from a transatlantic viewpoint as well, because it was very much determined and in many ways influenced and changed and participated and by people from different parts, not only of Latin America, but different parts of the world. So I do think that it just depends a lot on what you end up wanting and how you end up wanting to teach what you teach, but and do the scholarship that you want to pursue. But in my view, it's the fact that there is no grand viewpoint that unites us all is one of its perks. Let's put it like that.
Yeah, perhaps the questions that we ask. Yes, Sebastian.
So I was going to add one small thing to these great points that Rob and Cecilia were making, is that it's for me, it's always easy to forget how different institutional environments work differently. So in the US, clearly the sociology and the economics of our institutions means that we have a lot of freedom at the level of teaching generally, and numbers of students are key for our status, right? That means that the population we first have to convince of that what we're doing is interesting is our students. I know that in Holland, for example, where many of my friends work, students are secondary. It's the people who are in charge of the línea de investigación that you have to convince that this is a valid point of view. So the audience differs. Who do you have to convince that this is a valid and legitimate avenue can differ wildly across different institutional spaces. And I think that explains a lot of the different trajectories that these fields have taken in France or Germany or Spain or Latin America or the US or the UK, right? It has to do with those kind of nitty-gritty things that to whom are you pitching the proposal?
That's a very good point. Pedro, I see that you put something on the chat. Do you want to elaborate what this is that you can explain? You need to unmute yourself.
Yes, I was just, as Robert and Cecilia were speaking, I was reminded of a news headline that I read earlier today about a BBC broadcast of Don Quixote, and I was thinking, well, we're going to be in the Cervantes Institute later this morning. And this, and again in England, in the immediate post-war, a group of Spanish exiles and Latin American actors and voices participated in performing the first ever radio broadcast of 27 episodes of Quixote. And it allows us to think, the culture does not really belong to the Spanish state as such. And there were many moments throughout history in which different states have attempted to own and control culture. And allows us to think, in dialogue with what Sebastian was just saying, in any sort of post-Francoist university in Spain and Institute of Secondary Education, what is the purpose of studying Spanish literature? Is it still to reinforce a sort of nationalist narrative of the people? Or is it really to create the sort of training in textual literary and humanistic criticism that other places have defined humanist endeavors as? And so that tension between sort of national formation and national instruction almost, and national spirit and character is still very much within, and not just in Spain, I also see it in other places in Latin America, in Argentina, certainly, and in Mexico, and for sure in Cuba, where literature is a kind of avenue for ideological nationalist rhetoric and national formation. And if anything, the sort of space of opening, of looking at different records of people who were not tied to one country, who were influencing many other people across, and the way in which writers navigate culture is very different from the way in which states then conceive of how to deploy culture and how to use culture.
Well, that's a huge question to debate. We do have a couple of questions in the chat room. First one is actually from my colleague here, Adrian, who says, first, huge thanks to Rosi for organizing this event. Actually, the thank you should go to Instituto Cervantes and the editors, to you all, for the illuminating comments. It's good to see some old friends here and in the volume. My question is simple. Could you perhaps comment on the trans, not trans, in Transatlantic? Thank you. ¿Quién es el valiente?
I can very briefly address that and then let everyone else in the panel continue the conversation. I think it's interesting to think about the prefix, the trans, you know, as across, as beyond. So I think staking out as well, it addresses how we want to move beyond the field, and at the same time, and the many voyages or the many different journeys that have come across traveling through the Atlantic. So in that sense, trying to rethink the word trans makes us wanting to rethink those boundaries of peninsular versus Latin America, and in a way redefine what we're doing as moving beyond those boundaries. So that would be my very succinct answer to that, but it's a great question. Thank you.
Any of the editors want to address that?
I
Yes,
think
Robert.
building on what Cecilia said, and this is also in response to the second question from Benita, if we're all transatlanticists by now, what is next? I mean, on one level, we could say, you know, if you think about the way that transatlanticism is configured geographically, then another step would be to think transoceanically and to engage with the parts of the globe within the Indian and Pacific Oceans that were subject to Spanish and Portuguese colonialism. So in a purely geographic sense, I suppose that could be one next step. But I think that perhaps a better approach is not to think in terms of ever wider geographic scopes or novel ways of cordoning off parts of the globe and then studying those sections comparatively, but rather to recognize that, you know, maybe we all are transatlanticists or Iberian studies people, or who knows, engaged in inter-American studies, but fundamentally the methodology, I think, is similar in all of these approaches, in that we are, again, as we stated in the introduction, we're proposing an explicitly comparative approach to this field or field information. And as Pedro said, we're engaging in a sort of a constant metacritical critique and reflective critique of the field. And so I think the next step is really to continue to try to find the blind spots within our disciplines, to find sort of what these different geographic configurations and academic histories work to obscure. For instance, I'm thinking of Tom Harrington's chapter on Catalan immigrants in Uruguay. Yeah. That's the sort of text that wouldn't necessarily fit neatly into more traditional sort of understandings of what Hispanic studies or peninsular studies is. But it's precisely the sort of scholarship that transatlantic studies, as we've conceived it in a pluralistic sense, opens up. And I think by implication, a part of this reflective gesture and sort of metacriticism is a critique or a questioning of the geohistorical categories as well that these fields depend on. It's a logical next step is to ask, what is Latin America at the end of the day? What are some of the arbitrary experiences, subjectivities, cultures that this term binds together, and what does it exclude? And we could sort of undertake a similar operation for the Iberian Peninsula. What is the Iberian Peninsula? What does it include and exclude? And why do we tie that imagined geographic space to a field termed Hispanic studies or peninsular studies.
So following up that question, Benita asked, how does that intersect with the so-called global Hispanophone, which is one of the terms that was brought up earlier in our conversation?
I completely agree. I would say that perhaps one of the areas that we have, Cecilia has addressed it briefly, but that we've really not touched upon very deeply, perhaps in this conversation, because it's of course such an ambitious set of topics, and so many will not be discussed in detail. Is the line in which we cross the methodological and pedagogical with the institutional, and Hispanophone, the global Hispanophone seems to me to, of course, address and foreclose the discussion of language, because it is about speaking Spanish and teaching Spanish. Whereas I think the paradigm that we try to envision with transatlantic studies moves beyond the practice of teaching the language as our practice or praxis in the classroom. And we see ourselves more as cultural historians of intercultural sort of clashes, but intercultural influences and intercultural connections that take place in negotiations between different linguistic traditions as well. And of course, the global Hispanophone allows for that, but with the center being taken up by Spanish itself as the language or the vehicle. And I think that the linguistic component and how we see ourselves in the classroom and as practitioners, as scholars, is key here as one of the sort of boundaries or differentiations.
Cecilia.
I would follow up really quickly with that idea. I think that one of the things that we can offer through transatlantic studies is precisely its multilingual component, and the fact that we want to at least incorporate more of the Lusophone and the Africa, and that is moving forward. And what we learned, you asked us that question. I've been pondering upon that question. What are the many things that I learned as the editor, besides learning about the field and its multiple diverse viewpoints and the wonderful scholarship of my colleagues, is that and we wanted to be as inclusive as we could. And if there is another volume, which hopefully will be edited by someone else and not me, but I'm happy to participate. If we move forward and we think this, I would like Lusophone in Africa to play a more prevalent role. And part of it was that we just didn't find enough scholars that were working on these fields that wanted to participate in our transatlantic studies volume. And so maybe with more time and with more discussions, with more conferences on this, and therefore that would be something I would like the field to be moving towards, is to being even more multilingual, even more inclusive of other regions, even more challenging this idea of the global Hispanophone and not challenging it in a way that means that we're contrasting ourselves or totally saying that we cannot integrate it, but in a way that it means that we're opening it up.
Perhaps, Cecilia, I know that we're over time, Pedro, but I would like to allow this last question because I think it speaks to Cecilia's question. It's a really important question to end this conversation with. If you would allow me, the editors, if you want to say just one more minute.
Everybody's so interested in the subject, so no problem.
Thank you very much for your valuable contribution. This is from Miguel Antonio Guevara. In the face of this time of great cultural, technological, and geopolitical changes, what do you believe are the contributions of transatlantic studies in addressing the methodological and epistemological challenges of the present? Sebastian, I see that your mic is on, so I'm
Yeah,
thinking
right.
that you are trying to jump in here.
Well, I was just going to add something to what Cecilia said, which sort of undermines my very ability to answer this question. What I was going to say is that I think what distinguishes our vision of transatlantic studies, it fights against self-satisfaction. I think scholarly fields the temptation of self-satisfaction is very big in scholarly fields in general, especially if they're tied to global languages like Spanish, right? So that every time we see a statistic about how many countries now teach Spanish in high school, we go like, great for us, we're doing well, like, and we're happy, right? And I think that to claim that what we do can contribute something significant to general challenges of the present, I think it very quickly becomes an overcharged claim. So I'm very hesitant to answer the question for that reason, right? We're not, in a way, we're trying to sell the field, but we're also trying to resist the idea that this is about selling anything, right? And it's about or proclaiming this is the new be-all end-all of everything. So I would prefer to go back to Robert's point. Like we're trying to, the proof of the pudding is in what we can do in our classes and with our scholarship and next books, and then we'll see what perspectives it opens. But going back to Cecilia's point, I think the main, and to Pedro's point as well, is that if we can highlight blind spots, right, to keep calling out, as Benita and Pedro have always done in this project, like how about the Lusophone? How about Africa? Don't forget, right? I think that'll be the key, right? To not sort of from the get-go assume that large parts of this field do not exist. I think that would be a great contribution.
Thank you. And I think that a lot of these discussions have to do with language, which we did not have time to discuss a little bit more specifically, but the fact that we are always in need of a lingua franca, and certainly our choice of discussion today also reflects that reality of our communication. But on that note, I think that this has been a really enriching conversation. Thank you so much again for being here with us. Thank you to our audience for your questions, for your attention. Thank you again, Instituto Cervantes, for hosting this space and this conversation. We hope to see you after the summer. I think that we have 2 more lined up for the rest of the year, one on theater and censorship in Spain, and another on gender and literature in Spain with Jo Lavagni and a whole lot of excellent scholars of Iberian studies. So thank you again, Cecilia, Sebastian, Pedro, Robert. It was great to meet you through this conversation, and we wish you good luck and hopefully a second volume soon.
Muchas gracias a todos. Ha sido
Thank you.
fantástico.